Hello and welcome to this video on the MOOG WERKSTATT. Now up front, I'd like to thank MOOG for sponsoring this demo video. And some of you may remember, this is a little blast from the past, as the WERKSTATT was released back in 2014. Back for 2020 at around half the original price with the CV EXPANDER thrown in. And the WERKSTATT is a synth that you put together yourself. We'll look at doing that later in the video. And it's a simple analog synth, and without wanting to seem like I'm being biased, overly hyping something, or just parroting marketing spiel, it really is big, rich MOOG analog tone in a small, affordable package. And that's why I wanted to play with it and make this video. The WERKSTATT is a single oscillator with pulse width control for a pulse wave, an alternative saw wave, and frequency control. The oscillator goes into a 4-pole 24 dB MOOG ladder filter with cutoff and resonance control. Into a VCA, which we can make drone by turning it on, or modulate with an envelope. The basic envelope offers attack and decay control with a switched sustain. That can modulate the filter or the VCO with its PWM or its frequency. And we also have an LFO that can be triangle or square, which can also modulate the filter or the oscillator. We have an onboard keyboard to play the instrument or inputs on the CV EXPANDER, with a glide to bend and slide between notes on the keys. Note that doesn't work with an external input. The CV EXPANDER gives us plenty of I/O, with CV inputs for VCA level, filter cutoff, linear or exponential FM, and it's the exponential FM that is our 1 volt per octave input for external sequencing or control from keyboards with CV outputs. We can control the rate of the LFO with an FM input. We have our gate input for the envelope, audio input to the filter if you'd like to filter external signals, and we then get outputs for the onboard keyboard, the envelope, the LFO, the filter's output pre-VCA, and the oscillator's output pre-filter and VCA. It's a simple synth with enough patch points to offer some fun with other gear. It sounds great. The timing index is on screen if you wish to skip around. Any of the timing index in capital letters is no talking. They're little musical interludes. Skip around as you see fit, and let's dive in. So the build guide is 6 parts long, 5 if you don't count putting a sticker on the back. It looks like I'll need some scissors or some snips just to cut a washer and a Phillips crosshead screwdriver. So the first job is attaching the rubber feet to the bottom of the enclosure, and a simple push and twist is all you need to get them in there. We then need to cut a hole in this washer. I imagine some scissors would work, but I'm simply just going to snip a part out as the instructions say. We've then got 5 screws that will attach the circuit board to the bottom of the enclosure. Noting that we need to put the washer on the jack, the output jack at the back first, and then we put the nut over the outside of the enclosure. At this point they suggest testing, it all powers up, and we'll give that a go. We should see the red LED light for the LFO blinking in time with the LFO. So the next stage is to place these kind of little risers that go on top of these keyboard buttons before we then get into adding the top panel. And they just push on really nicely, you can feel them kind of click into place. So the last thing is to put the top panel on, use the 4 black screws, write our name on the serial number, built by Chief DivKid. Now it states in the manual that if you're using the CV expander, we need to remove these 2 right hand screws and use the provided 2 silver screws to go through the expander into the chassis. So carefully placing the pins on this header, this row of pins on the expander into those sockets, and then simply screwing it in with a pair of screws. So here we'll take a look at PWM, pulse width modulation, and with the oscillator set to square, turning the VCA on, and turning up the filter. This is our square or pulse tone, and if we set the mod to be on frequency instead of PWM, we have a manual pulse width control. And we can silence out 100% pulse width, which will actually cut off the sound. We can route the LFO or envelope to PWM. Using the LFO here, turning up the amount. We can hear a nice rich pulse width modulation sound. But this LFO will go up into audio rates, and there's some really nice overtones. So I'll up the rate of the LFO and play with the filtering as I do it. And you can hear that we can tune in these harmonic intervals between the tuning of the VCO, the audio oscillator we're listening to, and the LFO, which isn't so much of a low frequency oscillator but an audio one at this point. So here I'm having a little bit of modular WERKSTATT acid fun. But the really cool thing here is the exponential FM is sending in my pitch sequence, again from a Eurorack module, but I can still play and transpose that on the keyboard. So here we're looking at tremolo. Getting a tremolo effect on the WERKSTATT is as simple as plugging a cable from the LFO output to the VCA CV input. Removing this cable, which I'll come to shortly, we can see and hear the level is changing over time. But to make this LFO that bit more expressive, this kind of modulated modulation, just a bit more going on with the tremolo, we'll take the EG output, the envelope generator's output, and use that to modulate the rate of the LFO with the LFO FM input. Now the shape of this envelope will modulate that LFO, coming up and decaying back down in rate. Some interesting audio effects, but with a lower LFO rate. We get some interesting sounds. So by modulating the filter at audio rates, we can get some interesting vocal, glottal, formant-like tones. So I'm going to use an external oscillator. Any oscillator, be it Eurorack or another synth that you have, will work fine. Ideally sines or triangles, but again, other waveforms will work. And I'm going to plug this into the VCF CV input. Instantly, you can hear it's got this really kind of vocal-like tone. Bit more res. I'll change the rate of this external oscillator. A Eurorack module in my case. So here I'm looking at making percussion with the WERKSTATT. There's a single patch cable patching the LFO output to the gate input. LFO is set to be a square, so that's triggering the envelope, and the envelope is modulating the pitch of my oscillator and the cutoff, and the VCA is just droning wide open. So this patch starts with a square wave. I'm going to set the VCO mod to be envelope, so the modulation comes from the envelope, and set it to modulate frequency. Now pulses or saws are a bit too rich for most percussion sounds. They're quite farty and gabber kick drum like in some ways. So turning down the filter, you can hear we start to get some nice percussion. Modulating the filter, again with the envelope though, means we get a burst of these harmonics coming through, adding a bit of excitement and weight to the sound. It's quite easy to get some good analog kick drums. Thought I'd better patch up some vibrato. This is simply routing a tiny amount of VCO modulation from the LFO to the frequency of the oscillator. As I turn that up, you can hear quite an extreme effect. And with no modulation, no vibrato, very plain, just held notes, but just dialing in a tiny amount, gives us that kind of spooky vibrato-like sound. I have external VOP-Proctive coming into the exponential FM, our pitch input, an external gate for the envelope, and I've patched the envelope to modulate the rate of the LFO too. Now, a single VCO mono synth might not be the first thing you'd go to make drones. With a little additional patching and just a raw, thick, hefty voice of the WERKSTATT, we can certainly get some interesting analogue synth drones. The most noticeable thing here that's adding sonic weight and interest and modulation is the VCO output is controlling the VCA CV input. So my oscillator's output controls the level of the VCA. This is known as AM synthesis, amplitude modulation synthesis, and it's actually the VCO on the WERKSTATT that controls its own level. Have this on a handy little attenuator, I'll link these in the description, and this is simply reducing the amount of this modulation without the AM going on. You can hear it's a much simpler sound. So here's a fun and simple way to interact with other gear and make for a part sequenced, part live played synth sound on the WERKSTATT. An external gate signal with some ratcheting, that's that quick little 30-second note flurry in an otherwise 16th note pattern. And I also have a sequence coming to the filter's cutoff. So again, merging the onboard decay envelope with some sequencing. You can hear it makes for an interesting and dynamic kind of rolling bass sound. And because the external gate fires the envelope, I can jam around with the pitch on top and just let this pattern and bass line roll along. I'll change from saw to square, maybe add some PWM and play around with the filter and the depth of a filter modulation. So here we've got some pretty clangorous kind of alien noise zaps. Comment below what you think they should be called. Alien noise zaps is what I'm going with. Here it is in isolation. This is a random gate, which is just a continuous gate with varying probability as to whether that gate will fire or not, hence this broken up rhythm. I'm modulating the filter's cutoff with a random stepped voltage, but removing that, we can hear all the clangorous tone is simply coming from the WERKSTATT. There's nothing else going on here, it's dry into my mixer against these drum sounds, just a basic beat. Now these clangorous tones come from audio rate LFO modulation and high resonance, which is cranked up full. I'm modulating PWM and the filter with the LFO. Now the tuning of the oscillator, which isn't being adjusted, will have a big effect on the tone. And then adding a bit of modulation to that filter again. It's getting this resonant peak moving around, which robotically, alien-y, zaps around, if you will. And that's it for this video on the WERKSTATT from Moog. I hope it's been a useful video with some synth tips in there that you can try yourself. Do leave any comments in the question below. You can join my growing and amazing community at patreon.com/DivKid. Hit like, subscribe, all the usual gabba to end a YouTube video. And I'll see you next time. Cheers for watching. Bye.